Hello, and thank you for joining me for Storytime with Mr. C. I am Mr. C, and if you have come back for more stories, welcome back. If this is the first time you've ever joined me, well, welcome to the show. If you like what you hear, please go check out my other 17 episodes. Here on Storytime with Mr. C, I will be sharing stories that I have written, or a friend or family member has written, or maybe even something you have written. If you would like for me to share a story of yours here on Storytime with Mr. C, get your story or stories ready to go and shoot me an email at storytimewithmisterc@gmail.com. I have also put that email down in the description for you. For now, I'm going to ask that you please keep stories to a maximum of 2,000 words, and please keep them family friendly. And maybe I will read something you have written on a future episode. As always, a big thank you goes out to my buddy Russ for helping me out with my intro music. Russ is the bassist for local band Drive By High Five. If you get the opportunity to check them out, please do. Now, if you have listened to any of my previous episodes, you know that at about this point, I always offer a thank you to Ben over at Chasing the Whimsy. Ben was a major provider of the inspiration I needed to get this podcast going, and he still regularly checks in with me, still continues to provide words of encouragement and support, all of which means a whole lot to me. And Ben also shared with me that he tends to tune in every Monday morning to check out my latest episode, and when he does, he is usually joined by his mom and his grandma. And I thought, how appropriate that I should be starting on my Stories of the Matriarchs, knowing that I have at least a mom and a grandma as regular listeners. So, hello to Ben, Mom, and Grandma. Thank you for listening. I hope your Monday is treating you well, and I thank you so much for your continued support. It means a ton to me. And hey, folks, make sure you go check out Ben's podcast and show him some support. That is Chasing the Whimsy. You can find the link to his podcast down in the description. Go check it out. Show him some love, please. Support your podcasters. All right, I hope you all had an amazing Halloween. I hope you had tons of fun, saw tons of awesome costumes, ate way too much candy, and, just had an awesome Halloween season. Again, best time of the year. Now we've got to wait another, 360 some odd days till the next one. All right. I hope you also enjoyed our month of spooky stories. I'm going to have to put those away for now, and as promised, we are going to move forward with some stories from some of the members of my family. I come from a long line of storytellers, mostly on my mom's side, and I'm going to start sharing some of their writings with you as I dive into what I am calling the stories of the matriarchs. I am going to start way back with some stories from my mom's mom's mom, my maternal great-grandma, Ida. All right, folks, enough babbling. Here we go with episode 18. Stand by.
Storytime with Mr. C. Storytime.
Thank you once again for joining me for this episode of Storytime with Mr. C. This is the first story from my Stories of the Matriarchs. I will be reading a preface, and then Pigtails and Calico, all by my great-grandmother Ida. This reminiscence of childhood is by no means a literary masterpiece. Sometimes, as it occasionally does, time hangs rather heavily on my hands, since I am not able to stand the gaff, so to speak, of laboring at my housework all the time. Friends and relatives have apparently broken their right arms and are not able to keep my letters answered. George Gallup has not taken up any of my time asking my valuable opinions on timely topics of the day. No Lux or Ivory dealers are clamoring for my endorsement of their products in washing out my underthings. I am apparently an unknown genius as far as radio or movies are concerned, so I will look back on my childhood and jot down on paper some of the things I happen to remember the most vividly. If anyone derives a few moments of pleasure or relaxation from reading these memories, I will feel well paid for my efforts in trying to write something to while away an idle hour now and then. Ida, 1949. In 1850, my grandfather Jacob Spies, who was a soap maker by trade in the village of Worms in Hessen, Germany, sailed with his wife Mary and 9 children for the United States. Sometimes now, in these days of housing shortages, poverty, and general unrest that are pervading this country everywhere, I wonder how they had the courage to start out on such a long trip with a big family and not too much means with which to settle down. The trip was in a sailing vessel, and it took them 3 months to get here. My Aunt Mary, 12 years old, died and was buried at sea during the trip, so there were only 8 children when they landed in America. My father Louis was the youngest, being only 2 years old, so he never remembered anything about his native land. The family moved to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Grandmother Spies died sometime later. From Milwaukee they moved to northern Illinois, and some years later Grandfather Spies married again. Pa, as we children always called him, was a farmer all of his life. The history of Grandfather Spies is rather vague, as he died before I was born. Over 75 years ago, my father married my mother, Kate Englehart, who lived in a small village in northern Illinois. They spent the first 10 years or so of their early married life in Kansas. How I love to hear Mother talk about those early days in Kansas. My father always laughed when he told the story of how they first decided to move to Kansas after their marriage. It seemed that his older brother Adam Spies and their sister, Mrs. Gertrude Johnston, had settled there some years before. They wrote glowing letters to the folks all about the beauty of the climate and so on, and insisted that they come there to live. "Come down here where it is warm," they said. "Escape the cold Illinois winters. You can sit outside in your shirt sleeves and crack hickory nuts any day in the winter," Uncle Clark Johnston wrote. So the folks moved to Kansas soon after their marriage. Well, summer and fall were all right, but when winter really came, those mild days were over and a terrible cold spell came on. Mother said they just had a one-room sort of sod house with a dirt floor and a lean-to kitchen, and she froze her feet getting dinner one day. Oh, how Pa did tease Uncle Clark and Uncle Adam. "Get out the hickory nuts and take off your coat. Let's go outdoors and crack some hickory nuts." I guess a few winters before it had been quite mild, but once in a while it got really cold. Mother and Pa really enjoyed their early life there, I do believe. Mother said all the neighbors were so helpful and friendly and visited one another so much. They used to have dances in their little houses, putting all the beds and furniture outside to make room to dance. I guess they did not have much furniture but the barest necessities. The women went barefooted even to church in the schoolhouses, and wore their calico sunbonnets to church, but they were all poor together and thought nothing about it. One of the stories of early life in Kansas that I always thought was the most colorful is this one. One evening just about dusk or sundown, 2 men, one riding a black horse and the other a white horse, rode into the yard and asked to stay all night. Now, no one was ever a kinder or more hospitable man than my father, so the strangers put up their horses in the stable and went into the house to supper. They were just ordinary-looking men, but were very heavily armed. Pa remarked about their carrying so many guns, and they unstrapped them from their holsters, and Pa laid them up on a mantel. The men said they were on the trail of some horse thieves, which was a common occurrence at that time. While these men visited with my father, one of the children was somewhat ailing and very fussy, and one of the strangers took him on his lap and held and comforted him while Mother was getting supper ready. The next morning after breakfast, the strangers strapped on their guns and asked my father what the bill was for meals and lodging. He told them they were very welcome, but one of the men pulled out a roll of bills big enough to choke a cow, peeled off one, and gave it to Pa. They said thanks and goodbye and rode away. Pa and Mother thought nothing of this incident until Pa went to Parsons a few days later. He came home with a newspaper, greatly excited, and asked Mother if she knew who had been their overnight guests a few days before. When she said no, he said, "Frank and Jesse James." And there in the paper was a picture of the famous outlaws and their horses. They had robbed a bank at that time and were making a getaway, but had to stop somewhere to rest and feed their horses and get something to eat for themselves. I think father and mother sort of liked that famous pair, although they did not approve of some of their escapades. They seemed sort of gentle and quiet and had very likable personalities, so Pa said. "Oh, wouldn't you have been afraid of them if you had known who they were?" I asked. "No," Pa said. "They knew we had no money, and they did not steal from poor people or harm them in any way." Pa and Mother lived in Kansas about 10 years. They then came to Iowa, where I was born on a farm in the southern part of the state. I was the youngest of 12 children, 8 of whom lived to be over 50 years of age. 2 little brothers, Willie and Freddie, were born and died in Kansas. Many years later, when I was just a little girl, the enlarged picture agents were busy driving around to all the farms picking up pictures for enlarging. The parlor walls of most of the homes were fairly plastered with those enlarged pictures. I remember how my mother gave one of these agents a tin-type picture of the little dead brothers. She said nothing to my father about it, and when it was delivered, she told him to come into the parlor and see what she had bought. I can see Pa yet as he stood there in his faded blue work shirt and overalls with the tears running down his bearded cheeks as he looked at the picture of the little boys who had died many years before. We were a poor but rather happy family and had lots of good times together. I, being the youngest, was teased and patted alternately. I was a small, thin girl with pigtails of light hair which nothing could ever make curl and big blue-gray eyes. In fact, some of the kids used to call me Bug Eyes, and when they were in their most teasing mood, even Horse Eyes. My second teeth, when they first came in, were rather large for my mouth, and my upper lip being somewhat short, I was occasionally teased about my gopher teeth. However, I sort of grew into my teeth, and they are not now disfiguring. I was a dreamy sort of child, not too good in arithmetic at school, but I loved to read and cannot remember when I could not read. Years ago, we did not have the brightly colored papers we have now. A few newspapers, several farm papers, and a few magazines came into our home. I read them all cover to cover and waited impatiently for another month to roll around so we would get a new paper or magazine. How glad I was when a neighbor would give me a bundle of old magazines to read. I dearly loved the Youth's Companion, but it was an expensive magazine for those times, so we did not take it. The ones we did take were The Homestead and 20th Century Farmer. Pa took those for years, and I used to read a lot in them, even the veterinary columns. I think sometimes even now I can somewhat surprise my friends with my knowledge of livestock and their ailments. Mother took a few magazines, The American Woman, Good Literature, a very much misnamed periodical, by the way, and Happy Hours, all cheap sort of trashy magazines filled with a lot of continued stories such as The Heiress of Dunley, Sold for Gold, The Count's Double, and The Fatal Wedding. These were stories of impossible situations in very rich families which I devoured avidly for want of something better to read. I can remember some of those trashy stories to this day that I read over 40 years ago. Most of those magazines had a children's page to which we used to write letters, such as, "I am a little girl, 9 years old, and have a dog named Rover and a cat named Tabbyette." I wrote a story one time and sent it to the American Woman, and it was printed on the children's page. How proud and happy I was, although I never got any money for it, but I felt that I was really a writer for sure. The women's pages had letters from all over the country, starting out, "Dear Sisters," and telling us not to iron our tea towels or asking how to live at peace with in-laws. There were cooking recipes, canning recipes, homemaking hints on care of children, managing husbands, etc. There were exchange departments for postcards, quilt blocks, and stamps. Colored pictures were not very plentiful in those days. We used to get colored cards or cutout dolls in every sack of coffee, and we used to save coffee signatures or soap wrappers for cheap little dinky premiums. Another thing I liked were the white gum hearts with pictures on them. We used to get quite a stack of coffee cards and gum pictures. My dresses and coats were usually hand-me-downs from the older sisters, which did not please me too much. Everyday dresses were usually made of dark blue calico with small white figures. I think Mother used to buy that calico by the bolt. It came somewhat cheaper that way. How tired we all were of blue calico before it was used up and worn out. We could not get the bright-colored prints we have now. What little red or green calico there was faded rather badly and was not a very wise purchase, as it did not wash well. Blue washed better and was the old standby. Our underwear was made mostly of flour sacks. I remember so well how the rest of the kids laughed at me when a pair of flour sack panties Mother made for me had the word moonshine in big letters on one leg. Some of the printing was almost impossible to get out, but the sacks were made of much better material than they are now, and as we baked all of our own bread, we got a lot of them and had many things made from sacks. In summer, we wore big sunbonnets made of calico and straw matting, which I hated to wear, and which usually hung down my back, for I have always loved the sun. I got many a scolding from the big sisters for not keeping my bonnet on and for getting so tanned. That seems strange now, when girls try so hard to get a suntan and even use the dark powder, but years ago a white, milky complexion was greatly to be desired and considered quite the thing. So these recollections of childhood are written by a graying grandmother who 50 years ago was a little girl dressed in calico with big eyes and pigtails. Thank you so much for joining me for this 18th episode of Storytime with Mr. C. That was the first story from my Stories of the Matriarchs, called Pigtails and Calico, written by my great-grandma Ida back in 1949 when she decided to start putting these stories on paper for my mom and my uncle. Next week, on November 9th, we will continue with the Stories of the Matriarchs, and I will share the next story from my great-grandma Ida. In the meantime, send me some new material, go find Drive-By High Five, and go check out Ben's podcast, Chasing the Whimsy. Thanks again for hanging out and listening to my story. Hope you come on back for the next one. Until then, take care. Be safe.